asking how much damage can he really do in the next several months until the election? A lot of damage. And you know, you can't trust this president do what's right for this country. You can trust he will do what's right for Donald Trump.
What are you the most worried about him doing between now and Election Day, given what he's already done?
Well, I guess first and foremost, I'm worried that he'll continue this terrible mishandling of the pandemic, of the protests in our streets, that he will further divide us. He'll further leave Americans vulnerable to becoming ill and dying from the virus. But he will also continue this path of delegitimizing the votes of millions, seeking to disenfranchise them, but those who do vote by absentee, seeking to discredit those votes and contesting the results of the election. So that's a lot, I know, Joy, but sadly, he's given us every reason to be concerned about all those things.
You know, it was striking to hear Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, walk back his participation, which shocked so many people, including so many military people, that he took part in that political photo op. But Donald Trump has not backed down from what was done. As a matter of fact, he seemed to double down on this rhetoric of violence that he seems to sort of, you know, want to see committed against protesters. This was Donald Trump praising the National Guard response to Minneapolis protests. I want you to take a listen.
We are very proud of the fact that I called, I said, I'm sorry, we have to have them go in. And they went in, and it was like a knife cutting butter right through, boom. I'll never forget, you saw the scene on that road, wherever it may be, in the city, Minneapolis. They were lined up, boom, they just walked straight. And yes, there was some tear gas and probably some other things, and the crowd dispersed and they went through. By the end of that evening, and it was a short evening, everything was fine, and you didn't hear too much about that location having problems anymore.
First of all, it was the Minneapolis police who were the ones who were accused of mistreating protesters. But like a knife through butter, it is a strange way to talk about the American military troops on the streets of an American city. He seems to almost be sort of glorifying and just the idea and just sort of imagining violence. It is odd. What do you make of it?
Well, he does glorify violence, and I think from the beginning of these peaceful protests, he's really tried to egg on this kind of violence in the streets, egg on a more militaristic response by police, calling in troops. You know, look, I was glad to see General Milley acknowledge the terrible mistake that he made, and I think it was very important that we had people like Secretary Mattis speak out, Colin Powell speak out, and others. I think that's a big reason why General Milley felt he needed to do what he did. But as we pointed out during the trial, this president is not going to change. He has this love and fascination for autocrats around the world. He models his own conduct after them. He praised the Chinese for their crackdown in Tiananmen Square. So we can't be surprised when he now lashes out at peaceful protesters, calls them terrorists, you know, brags essentially about the ability to use police or military force against them. And he's not going to change. But what we really do need is people around him, people in Congress, to stand up to him, speak out, do what they can to constrain him through the remaining months of this presidency. We'd be a lot better off, Joy, frankly, if he went back into his bunker and waited out the rest of his presidency instead of doing more harm.
Yeah, it wasn't lost on many of us that he turned around and tried to threaten governors the same way he tried to threaten the president of Ukraine, using the same formula. Not lost on a lot of Americans. And just to note, just to put a button on his sort of treatment of the way he thinks about the military and the way the rest of the world should treat it, he has now authorized sanctions against International Criminal Court members who are probing possible Afghan war crimes by U.S. personnel. So I think that tells you what he thinks. But I want to ask you about one other thing while I have you. The other thing, there's been a lot of talk about looting. But looting can mean a lot of things. And I think for a lot of Americans, what feels like looting is $500 or $600 billion being squirreled away by the Treasury Secretary, and the American people don't get to know who got it. Here is a headline from the Washington Post. The Trump administration won't say who got $511 billion in taxpayer-backed coronavirus loans. The apparent decision to withhold loan records is the latest of several actions by the Trump administration that could shield the federal coronavirus response from public scrutiny. The Trump administration has taken steps to undermine the independence of executive oversight bodies, declaring that the special inspector general overseeing the CARES Act funding cannot submit reports to Congress without presidential supervision. Sir, are you going to, as a member of Congress, as a senior member of Congress, going to be able to find out for the American people who Steve Mnuchin is giving that money to, the American people's money?
We are going to find out. We're going to keep pressing until we do. There will be accountability. But true to form, the president is resisting all of that, firing inspector generals, going to extraordinary lengths to try to keep from the country, for example, not just these loans that went out through the SBA, but this whole industry fund. We have very little visibility into how those funds are being used. But what we can see in terms of the administration's actions is an administration characterized by nepotism, corruption, cronyism, and we're going to get to the bottom of all of the mis-expenditures by this administration. And I think as we saw in the months leading up to the Senate trial, their ability to keep things secret only goes so far. The truth comes out in the end. And we just need to make sure that we can hold this president accountable in real time and make sure those dollars get to Americans that really need them.
But how's our government doing in the midst of these challenges? How are they rising to these challenges? Well, today, the president went to Dallas, Texas, to do an event focused on race and policing. Okay, a policing event in Dallas. Well, in Dallas, the police chief is African-American. In Dallas, the sheriff is African-American. In Dallas, the local DA, the lead prosecutor for Dallas, is also African-American. So the president today comes to Dallas for his race and policing event. The White House invites none of those local officials to the president's event. All top law enforcement officials in Dallas are all black. None of them were invited to the president's event in Dallas to talk about law enforcement. Now, the White House says they did invite the mayor of Dallas, Mayor Eric Johnson, who is also African-American. Mayor Johnson's office told the White House that he was otherwise engaged, which is understandable. I mean, how would you, the mayor, sort of show your face at the race and policing event with the president in your town when all of the top law enforcement people in your town were excluded and they all happen to be black? How would you go on being the mayor and dealing with law enforcement in your community if that's what you did, if you showed up for that when none of the other folks were invited? How else is the government doing right now? Well, today, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, issued a videotaped straight-to-camera apology for taking part in that Death of the Republic photo op where he marched out of the White House alongside the president wearing his combat fatigues and representing the United States military after the Attorney General had ordered federal forces to shoot gas and rubber bullets at peaceful protesters outside the White House so the president could go pose for pictures holding a Bible on the other side of Lafayette Park. General Milley was there at that event, lending his credibility and the apparent support of the U.S. military in his person to that event with the president. Later that night, he went out still in his combat fatigues to go strut around the streets of Washington, D.C. He said to survey the situation. This was after the president had told the nation's governors that day, cryptically, that he was putting General Milley, quote, in charge. In charge of what? I don't know, but having a uniformed general walk around Washington, D.C. like he owns the place when maybe the president just told him he does own the place was something more than unsettling. And we don't know why it took a week and a half for General Milley to realize the gravity of what he did wrong there and apologize for it. But he has apologized for it now, and that itself is an important thing.
As many of you saw the result of the photograph of me at Lafayette Square last week, that sparked a national debate about the role of the military in civil society. I should not have been there. My presence in that moment and in that environment created a perception of the military involved in domestic politics. As a commissioned, uniformed officer, it was a mistake that I've learned from, and I sincerely hope we all can learn from it. We who wear the cloth of our nation come from the people of our nation, and we must hold dear the principle of an apolitical military that is so deeply rooted in the very essence of our republic.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, today. You know, it is a hallmark of this moment in time that I'd guess about half the country now assumes that because General Milley said that, because he talked about how people in the military who wear the cloth of our nation come from the people of our nation, we must hold dear the principle of an apolitical military. I would guess about half the country now assumes that because General Milley said that, the president will soon find a reason to replace General Milley with somebody else who either doesn't feel that way about the necessity of an apolitical military, or someone who at least can be counted on not to say so out loud. Snapshots of things going on, but this is happening all over the country. The ban on the use of chokeholds, reform measures for police departments that are more drastic, more creative, more progressive than we have seen in a generation. It's happening all over the country. Meanwhile, at his Don't Invite the Black Police Chief policing event in Dallas today, the president of our country said out loud that seeing tear gas used against protesters these past couple of weeks was to him, quote, a beautiful scene. That was his phrase, a beautiful scene. He said seeing tear gas used against protesters was beautiful. He said it was like a knife cutting butter. And, you know, I feel like if we have learned one thing over these past 3+ years, we have learned that the sickness that you feel in hearing that remark from the president and reading that quote from the president loves that turns your stomach. I mean, the whole point of him saying stuff like that, of his campaign now making ads out of the clubbing and beating of protesters, the whole point of it is because he knows it makes you sick. He lives for your outrage. He lives for our outrage, right?
You couldn't believe it when the White House announced that Donald Trump was going to Dallas today to give a speech on race relations and policing in America. You were right. Turns out there was no reason to believe that the White House was lying, except about the going to Dallas part. Donald Trump went to a TV megachurch in Dallas where he was supposed to chair a roundtable discussion, which included the Attorney General of the United States. Donald Trump read a few words of a prepared statement, but mostly he just rambled Trump style. And he never talked about race relations in America, and he never mentioned George Floyd's name, and he never talked about policing in America. But he did lie about policing in America. He lied about what the new phrase, defund the police, means. It's simply the tightest bumper sticker way of saying reduce police budgets and redistribute parts of those police budgets to other government spending and community spending. And here's the way Donald Trump lied about that. He said, I heard they wanted to close up all police forces. We want the police force closed. It's not like they want to sort of bring a little money into something else. They want it actually closed. No. It's like they want to bring a little money into something else. That's what they actually mean. Donald Trump lied about that. Donald Trump felt free to lie about that today in not just a church, but a mega church, a TV mega church, the kind of church you'd think maybe Donald Trump on some level might respect. And William Barr, who proclaims himself a devout Catholic, lied in that church today too, when he said, we've never had a president who is more committed to reforming law enforcement. He said it, and he didn't laugh his way through it the way I just had to. You would think that the pious Mr. Barr would have heard himself begin to say that and thought, no, I can't tell that kind of lie in a church. You would think that if you had not seen how William Barr and Donald Trump treated this church in Washington, D.C., across from the White House, as just a backdrop for a photo op, which was condemned by the pastor of that church and was condemned by the bishop of that church, and was only made possible because Donald Trump and William Barr used tear gas on American citizens exercising their First Amendment right to protest in that location that Donald Trump wanted to use as a photo op. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, is now so ashamed of his participation in that photo op that today he apologized, which we will discuss later in this hour. People at all other levels of government are taking action. The governor of Minnesota, the state where George Floyd was murdered, has endorsed a new package of police reforms that the governor says have been needed for a long time. The reforms would make it automatic that the Attorney General of Minnesota would investigate all police officer-involved deaths in the state. It tightens the rule on the use of deadly force. It creates new alternatives to policing that would divert some police calls to social workers for issues better handled by them. It strengthens police oversight, and it prohibits police use of chokeholds in the state of Minnesota. San Francisco Mayor London Breed introduced a new plan for police reform. The San Francisco Chronicle reports Breed's proposal would remove sworn officers from such calls for non-criminal activities, replacing them with trained and non-armed professionals who she said would be better equipped to handle situations like neighbor disputes, school discipline interventions, or behavioral health crises. The reforms would additionally fortify accountability policies, ban the use of military-grade weapons, and divert funding to communities of color. The director of the Miami-Dade Police Department, Alfredo Ramirez, said that his agency will no longer use chokeholds. Chief Ramirez said, as a progressive agency, we must remain in a constant state of review and open to emerging best practices and community feedback. That's from the largest police agency in the state of Florida. And the Seattle City Council has unanimously decided to start digging into the police budget to see how much of that budget could be redirected to other services and community-based programs. That is just some of what happened in America on police reform and race relations on this day in history, June 11th, 2020, when the President of the United States was supposed to, but failed to, speak to the nation about race relations and policing in America. But on this very day, June 11th, a president once did speak to the nation about those subjects. It was June 11th, 1963, a day no one who saw it unfold on television could forget, when President John Fitzgerald Kennedy mobilized the National Guard to integrate the University of Alabama and allow 2 black students to be the first African Americans to register at the University of Alabama. Governor George Wallace stood in the doorway full of Trump-like bluster to block those students, but he surrendered when President Kennedy's Deputy Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, stared down that angry, hateful man and told George Wallace that he had no choice. We now live in a country where the president echoes the racism of George Wallace, but we once lived in a country where, at historic moments like this, the President of the United States knew how to address what he called a moral crisis.
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
The 6th month of the year 2020, America is finally moving, albeit fitfully, towards a consensus on banning chokeholds by police officers and toppling statues of racist traitors. It's a remarkable moment, both because it has taken so long to get here, and also because it does represent very significant progress. On Monday, after House Democrats unveiled a sweeping bill to reform policing that included a ban on chokeholds, among other items, today, the top Republican in the House, Kevin McCarthy, says he agrees with that ban and that his party conceptually agrees with much of what House Democrats proposed.
do you support banning chokeholds?
Yes. Especially in the concept, if you watch within a bill coming forward, the idea of someone that would have a chokehold when somebody is handcuffed or others, there should be severe consequences.
There should be severe consequences. That's been true for a long time. That is not something Republicans were saying before the protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd. Now, public opinion has dramatically pushed in the direction of police reform at the minimum, something even more perhaps. Also today we learned Republican Senator Rand Paul, who has spoken out against no-knock warrants before, is filing legislation to ban them nationwide. No-knock warrants are the ones that led to the police killing of 26-year-old EMT Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. Police just showing up and knocking down her door. Her boyfriend had no idea who it was. Republicans still have yet to agree on and unveil their overall police reform plan, and who knows where they will land. But it all does count as progress, incremental though it may be. As does the toppling of statues of racist traitors, like this one of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, which came down last night in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. Many of these Confederate statues that you're seeing come down were not erected in mournful commemoration of defeat, but as a kind of marking of a victory over the forces of black equality during the rise of the Jim Crow South, decades or more after the end of the Civil War. They were put there as a rebuke to black Americans after Reconstruction, after their claims for equality had been beaten back, often violently, by white supremacist policies and governments. That statue of Jefferson Davis that came down last night, it was erected by a so-called Confederate heritage group in 1907, 40 years after the war, during a period when thousands of black Americans were being lynched across this nation, in the South particularly. This bust of Confederate general and early KKK leader Nathan Bedford Forrest was put up in the Tennessee state capitol in 1978. How's that for history? 1978. These statues were not erected to some outpouring of grief and loss, no. They were explicitly, at the time, symbols of white supremacy. They said, "We are back in charge, and you'll remember that every time you walk by this statue." On Tuesday, Tennessee state lawmakers, most of whom are Republicans, voted to keep that bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who's really, by the way, one of the worst, in the Capitol building. And that is the thing. While we are seeing signs of progress, the Republican Party, the party that defeated the Confederacy, the party that was born to defeat the Confederacy, has become the home of the Confederacy's last defenders. And that element of the party has a champion the current president, who says he will not even consider renaming military bases honoring Confederates. Which, why are there U.S. Army bases named after traitors in the year 2020? Traitors who killed American troops. Of course, that is who the president is. He's the guy who defended marchers at a white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, who were there to support a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, some of whom chanted, "Jews will not replace us," and one of whom murdered a peaceful protester in cold blood the next day. Donald Trump means a lot to racists, and he knows that. There's an undeniable racial component to the bond. He has a certain part of his base. There is a reason why these guys in New Jersey, who despicably recreated the image of George Floyd's death while confronting Black Lives Matter protesters, are proudly displaying a Trump flag. They know what that symbolism is. They know what that flag means and what it stands for. The Trump flag, in that context, is not that different from a Jefferson Davis statue, and the meaning to those men. It is not that different from a Confederate flag. They know what it means. It's not an accident. And Donald Trump is supposed to be the person to offer some concrete solutions to racial inequities in America, or policing, or really anything. Late this afternoon, the president held a roundtable on race relations and policing at a conservative evangelical megachurch in Dallas. He alternated between reading awkwardly off his script and ad-libbing about all kinds of stuff. It amounted to a whole lot of nothing, as per usual, just empty words. But in the other political coalition in America, it's a majority political coalition at this moment, at least if you believe the polling, if you look at the 2018 results, if you look at the 2016 results in the presidential election, that coalition is genuinely multiracial, and it doesn't agree on everything at all. In fact, there is real, sometimes vicious, intense, substantive debate and conflict happening over questions of racial equality and policing and racial hierarchy and reparations and making the country anew. And the candidate nominated by that political coalition, who today presented his proposals for getting the economy back on track, has also released a long list of reform proposals, including a ban on chokeholds, like the House legislation, a federal police oversight commission, and new standards for when police can use force. Last week, he said this in a speech addressing systemic racism.
We've had talk before. We've had protests before. We've got to now vow to make this at least an era of action and reverse the systemic racism with a long overdue concrete changes.
Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer, a one-time religious rights activist in the 1970s and 80s with my evangelist, Father Francis Schaefer, and now I guess you would describe me as a liberal activist. Doing my bit in the resistance to the worst president this United States has ever elected in my lifetime, certainly. That includes Richard Nixon, and that is Donald Trump. But, you know, as we talk about impeachment and hearings and Russia and Putin and corruption and the nepotism of his family and Breitbart.com and all these other people, let's not lose track of something. The only reason Donald Trump is president is because we had a black president, and the resentment of the white oligarchy and the racist and the xenophobic white evangelicals who designed an entire Christian school movement in the 70s and 80s to try to end-run integration. These people who followed people like the segregationist Jerry Falwell Sr., whose son now runs Liberty University, are reacting to the first black presidency. And their reaction was to elect the most unqualified president to replace perhaps the best president this country's had in my lifetime, the most erudite, the most educated, the most well-spoken, the best temperament we've had in a president that I can remember, a true leader. And it's almost like a parody of something like Paradise Lost or Satan's Fall from Heaven, whatever it might be. The reaction against this wonderful figure of President Obama, who endured an 8-year slow-motion lynching by the white mob, the oligarchs, the alt-right, the white supremacists, and all the rest of it. It's almost like a parody. You know, I don't even think Shakespeare would have cooked up something like this, to go from someone so luminous and so bright and so well qualified, but also just so deeply human, the good husband of a wife, a faithful father, someone who is there for his family. And instead we get this adulterous swine, this philanderer, this molester of woman, this person with criminal impulses who lies his way through life, this con man, this multiple bankrupt, this person who's opened this whole Pandora's box of a relationship with our sworn enemy in Russia, and the murderer, the mass murderer, and the assassin and killer Vladimir Putin, who kills his opponents, who jails them, who beats them. To go from Barack Obama to Trump is really mind-boggling, but it's only explicable by the depth of the racism. The magnifying glass that Trump's election puts on our country goes to show that, yes, indeed, 40% or so of the American public are uneducated, racist fools who occupy this white underclass that, by the way, is where all the so-called real welfare mothers live. White older males my age are the people who are essentially out there sucking up dollars from the federal system, from Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security and unemployment benefits and disability, huge amounts of white males on disability, in comparison to the productive black community that the whites like to disparage, who are forging ahead economically, and that in spite of the mass incarceration of the new Jim Crow, where male black men have been locked up on the dubious pretext of minor drug charges by the millions to try to control that population out of black ascendancy into our culture. And so I just want to point out, you know, as we struggle, as we resist, let's remember the truth of the matter. The entire fiasco of Trump is made possible by the resentment of white fools, from the billionaire oligarchs and people like Jeff Sessions and Mike Pence, all the way down to the know-nothing twits flying Confederate flags on the back of their stupid pickup trucks, roaring up and down highways. This entire stupid movement, this fart in the wind, which will blow away and be replaced by a multicultural, decent, fair society that will look at this moment with mind-boggling propensity, saying, what on earth was this about? Just remember this. It is the reaction to a first black president. And otherwise, none of this is explicable, especially the fact that the Republican Party continues to go along with this mentally unstable, unfit fool. Can only be explained by the continuing reaction and obstruction that they cannot get out of the habit of. They're still obstructing the Obama presidency, even though Obama is no longer president. Go figure. Thank you. My name is Frank Schaefer.